or good morning, depending upon where you are. It's Sean Gibbons from the Communications Network. Delighted to be with you. Want to tell you a couple things before we get underway with today's webinar session. First, if you are a member of the Communications Network, a member in good standing, keep an eye on your mailbox. We're not sending you a holiday card, hopefully something a little bit better, the new issue of Change Agent, which is the network's journal that collects ideas and trends and new strategies. That is in the mail as of today. Should be arriving in your mailbox the next few days if you're still around and in the office. Some really fantastic stuff to share with you from Surfrider. We've heard from the folks at Kaiser Health News. It's a fantastic interview with Atul Gawande, who's one of the writers for The New Yorker and a very well-known doctor and writer on health policy. Some really, really fascinating stuff, so I want to encourage you to keep an eye out for that. Also, if you haven't already done so and made your plans to go to Miami Beach next September, might be time to start thinking about doing that, especially as the weather takes a turn to the cold, depending upon where you are. Polar vortex may be visiting you in the next couple of days. Miami will not be seeing that weather, and registration's already open for the conference, which runs September 27th through the 29th at the historic Fontainebleau Hotel, which just underwent a $1 billion renovation. Really lovely. And then finally, if you're a network member and you have not yet gone in to update your profile, we built a brand new members community, which has a directory and also the ability to ask questions and check in with your colleagues, workshop ideas, and things that you're looking for information or ideas. It's a great place to go. There's 1,000 folks in there at your fingertips. Really great stuff. All right, so that's enough of me shilling for the network. Why don't we go ahead and get underway? We are joined today by Sarah Beaulieu, who's a strategic communications. I got that right, didn't I?
You got that right.
All right. Okay, cool. Sarah is a strategic communications expert and senior advisor at the Greenlight Fund up in Boston, where it's probably gotten a little bit chilly. She's also an advocate and speaker on sexual violence, and we're really honored and pleased to have her with us today. She's really well equipped to lead us through this discussion because we are going to be talking about controversy, all the stuff that you are not supposed to talk about at the dinner table. And I know Sarah has had deep experience in this space, and I think all of us, particularly in light of the events surrounding the election, are probably wondering what's ahead. And while I don't think any of us has a crystal ball and can actually answer that question with any confidence, it's not unreasonable to think that there may be some moments that will be called upon over the next few months, next few years, to weigh in places that perhaps seem a little outside of our wheelhouse. But that not standing up, not raising our voices on behalf of the institutions we serve, will feel a bit bereft and a bit at a loss when we see things going on around the world that maybe don't align with our values. So Sarah's going to talk to us over the next hour about what makes it hard for nonprofits and foundations to engage in uncomfortable topics. We're going to spend some time thinking about why you might want to engage in communicating either internally or out to the wider world about a topic that's controversial or even taboo, right? We're going to talk a little bit about how to craft and test a message or messages that are authentic to your work, to your organization. And we're going to think about some low-risk ways to approach uncomfortable topics. Now, before we do all of that, and I hand this off to Sarah, just a couple quick logistical items. Number one, please use the chat box. If you have questions at any point during the course of this presentation, you can type them in there. It's in the lower left-hand corner of your, and Alex, yes, I will try to speak up. It's in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Type your questions in there. Tristan and I will be keeping an eye on them. We'll flag them and ask them of Sarah at a couple different points in the presentation. And then at the end, we're going to ask you to please make sure that you stand by and do a quick survey. Let us know how we did today. Other thing I want to just flag for you, if you are a person who tweets, we know that apparently lots of powerful people do, go ahead and join us on the hashtag ComNetLive. That's ComNetLive, ComNetLive. You can ask questions there. We'll be monitoring that as well over the course of the hour. And with that, why don't I go ahead and hand it over to Sarah. Sarah, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Sean. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to this amazing group of communications professionals that are part of the ComNet network. Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Tristan, for making this webinar magic happen. And I think just to echo Sean, really encourage you to ask questions. Really no question is going to be, we're talking about controversy, so don't worry if your question is controversial. Let's just do it. So just a little bit about what we are going to cover today to echo what Sean was saying. So I am going to start by doing a little bit of introduction, not really about my background, but about sort of how I came to talk about controversial issues on such a regular basis. Talk a little bit about why, as nonprofits and foundations, we really should be wading into topics that we might not think are part of our wheelhouse. 3, talk a little bit about how to do that. So give a little bit of a strategic overview about what's different in terms of communication strategies around taboo topics versus the core mission of your organization. And then we'll pause for questions there, and then we'll come back and I'm going to share just a bunch of different examples, as many as we have time for, about how different leaders and organizations have really sort of adopted this and put this into practice across a couple of different issues. So first, my story in 3 parts. I'm actually going to save one of the parts for the very end. But so this is me. I'm not going to read my bio to you at all, but a little bit about my background and experience. But what I want to do is tell you something about myself that is not a part of my professional bio, that is still relevant to our conversation today. And that is that I myself am a survivor of sexual violence. So I was sexually abused by my grandparents as a child and date raped by a friend in high school. And in college, I was one of the fortunate ones who was able to access the help and healing that I needed, primarily because I had a family who was willing to pay for it. And then I graduated. I graduated from Brown University. I started my career. And over the course of my career, it wasn't as though I kept this part of my life and my experience a secret. It was just that the topic never really came up. And it was about 5 years ago, when I was working at Be the Change and kind of crisscrossing the country, talking to lots of different nonprofit leaders and foundation leaders and corporate social responsibility leaders, and in the role that I had, that I suddenly realized that I was kind of in the closet about it, and that bothered me. And so I did 2 things, right? So one is I just sort of started casually dropping the fact that I was a survivor into conversation. And then the second thing is that I started this project to figure out if there was a way for me to leverage my professional energy against this issue in a way that would be helpful. And so this was my first foray. So what I'm showing you here is actually the third thing that I ever posted on Tumblr. And I will tell you, my first attempt at communicating about sexual violence from a sort of strategic perspective was an absolute failure. So this story is about a failure. So this graphic, which I created with the help of my brother, who's an awesome graphic designer, my idea was I wanted to say, hey, guys, in this conversation about sexual violence, you really don't need to be afraid of being falsely accused of rape, because there's a small chance that you'll actually be falsely accused. There's a much larger chance that you could rape somebody and get away with it. So I thought this would be interesting. There are sort of men who are afraid of false accusation, and I was going to help have a conversation about this topic. So that was what I wanted the graphic to do. So I posted it on Tumblr, and then I woke up the next morning, and this is what I saw. So this is the Wonk blog. Dylan Matthews from the Wonk blog picked it up and posted it. It was featured on Jezebel, and the next thing I knew, at this point I think that it's been shared and reblogged about 600,000 times. So this thing went viral around the world. So great, right? That's a win, amazing, right? From an exposure and engagement perspective, a total knock it out of the park. Incredible, right? Thousands of people were visiting the website that I had just created for myself. But then there was also these headlines. So what I realized, and what I realized in retrospect, is that I actually had stepped into a major landmine. So the issue of false accusation in the larger conversation of sexual violence was like a total minefield, and it activated the sort of a vitriolic response from multiple, sort of groups of people, right? So there were the men's rights activists, there were feminist groups that, said that I wasn't using data responsibly, and I'm sort of saying, gosh, like I had no idea, right? And inadvertently, what I did was that I contributed to the very dynamics that I was trying to change, right? So there was more shame, more blame, more anger, more finger pointing, all of which was the stuff that I was trying to do away with. And so what I learned was, my experience as a survivor, my experience, even working on the issue of sexual violence, it didn't actually make me an expert on how to communicate about it. And so I really learned that the hard way. But what this experience did for me is that it made me really interested and really curious about what it does take to communicate about taboo and uncomfortable topics. And so that's actually what I had, and it ultimately changed the way that I approach this in many ways that I talk about sexual violence and other uncomfortable topics. And that has been the focus of my work alongside my, the work that I do with the Greenlight Fund. And so I will circle back to the third part of my story at the end, which is kind of how I have learned my lessons and applied what I am about to talk to you about in new ways. So, so now just to pivot, so now we'll pivot, that was my story, and so now we're going to pivot to the why, right? So Sean really pointed to the moment in time that we are living in, right? So sort of we are living in a time where the ways in which human beings hurt and oppress each other is so central to our everyday life. I mean, I think you can't wake up in the morning and walk through the day without hearing a story about, somebody hurting somebody else, whether it's about their race, their religion, their politics, their gender. And yet, it is such an uncomfortable thing to talk about. So it is this universal experience of the majority, it's like the significant number of us in the world, right? But yet it's really uncomfortable. It's an incredibly uncomfortable thing. And so what do you do? So do you stay, when you are faced with a conversation about sexual violence, about abortion, about race or racism, about religion, about politics, about mental health, do you speak out, right? Or do you stay silent? And when the stakes are so high, how do we find that boldness and bravery in ourselves to step forward? And then how do you connect that to the work that you are being paid to do inside of your organization and the work that you have chosen to do? So, I'm wondering if any of you have heard some of these things before. So these are some of the things that I often would hear when I would go out and ask nonprofit organizations and foundations kind of, why don't you talk about the issue of sexual violence? I think I had probably 200 or 300 conversations like this. And this was a sort of a common theme, right? So it was, we're not an advocacy organization. Well, it's this is like a really important issue, but it's not our issue. This is something that is off message to it. How can we really be all things to all people, right? And so I think a lot of times we ask ourselves some of these, we respond to an uncomfortable topic with one of these canned responses, right? But why should you get uncomfortable? So, I think, personally, I think, if you start to take a 360-degree look at the individuals who are in your network, so who on your board is a survivor of sexual violence? How many of your staff members have had abortions? How many of your clients or your grantees' clients are Muslim? Are these questions that you even know the answer to? Have you asked the question, right? So I think, the challenge is that organizations are often single issue, but human beings are not, right? And so when we are thinking about an uncomfortable topic, so, I listed a bunch of them at the beginning, but it's, if it's sexual violence, How does this issue impact our constituents? How does it impact our grantees, our staff, our board, our donors? Is this issue so relevant in the public dialogue that it would be tone deaf for us to send out our regular monthly newsletter, right? And so I think these are really important things to consider. So I think that's the why. But then, so if you are on board with me, and I hope that you are, that it is in fact important to talk about these controversial topics, then how do you do it, right? So how do you do it in a way that's real, right? I think that these topics are highly emotional, they're highly personal. They speak to something that that is really kind of core to who we are as human beings, but just because you might have that courage or that boldness inside of you doesn't necessarily mean you kind of have that path through. So let's have a conversation about the how on this, right? So number one, your kind of standard communications basics still apply. So, one, know your organization. 2, know your audiences. 3, have clear messages. 4, handle the channel. Handle your channels. Know which channels you're communicating through. So, I say this. Obviously, the whole reason that ComNet exists is to help organizations actually do and achieve this. So, I recognize that this is not easy, but there are also some special considerations when it comes to taboo or uncomfortable topics. So the first one is yourself, right? So I think we are our own worst enemy when it comes to understanding a taboo or uncomfortable topic, simply because if a topic's not talked about, there's not always kind of readily available information, right? And in some cases, maybe there is an unresolved issue that you've had in your own personal life, in your family, that is related to the issue that you're trying to address. And so, while self-awareness is generally, is just in general a good thing to have, it's kind of a mission critical thing to get as self-aware as you possibly can when it comes to a topic that is taboo. And to really make sure that you know how your experience might impact the way that you view the topic. And then to get information and be curious about whether or not your assumptions are the right assumptions or not the right assumptions. So I think the second piece is really thinking about the data. So, what data is out there? What does the data really tell me? I will tell you, read the actual reports yourself, not the articles about the report, because I think, this is a group that knows better than most that there are ways to, to use data to support a message versus to create your message that tells the story of the data. And so understanding how people are communicating to you about a topic requires you to get a little bit more technical and research-oriented. And 3, I think, is to be really curious. Like, what questions do you still have? Have hate crimes taken place in my neighborhood? How would I know if they did? Who has abortions? Are they, what is the race or religious background or income status of people who've actually had abortions? And is that something that you know the answer to? Why haven't I read about suicides in my community in the newspaper lately? So I think the more curious that you get, the more that you might figure out that there might not actually be good answers to some of those questions, because when a topic is taboo, it's often underfunded, it's often under-researched, and so which is part of the challenge to how you communicate about it, and sometimes a really good place to start in terms of communicating about it. So I want to give you an example of how this plays out for the issue of sexual violence. So, so I think a lot of us think about sexual violence as a women's issue, and it is true that 1 in 4 U.S. women will be sexually abused or assaulted in their lifetimes, but so will 1 out of 6 men. So the idea that it's like, well, we're not focused on women's issues, that's like not really relevant. So, another one, if you're, so let's say you're the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Well, sexual violence is a health issue. When you are exposed to sexual trauma, you have a greater chance of risk of certain health conditions, so obesity, heart disease, diabetes. So if you are a foundation or a nonprofit organization that is focused on these issues and you want to think about preventing sexual violence is a way to get at your issue. This is an education issue. So let's say you're the Lumina Foundation or the Gates Foundation. Men and women who are sexually abused, they face higher rates of delinquency. They face higher rates of dropping out of school. The girls who are sexually abused have academic difficulties. So, if the problem that you are trying to solve is high school graduation, if you're a member of the America's Promise Alliance and you are really focused on the high school dropout rate, the issue of sexual violence is relevant to your work. I think, it's obviously a mental health issue. So, again, when you really start to look at an issue holistically and think about all of the ways that it might connect to yours, you might be surprised. So that's kind of number one. So really kind of unpack the issue, make sure you understand it from all perspectives, make sure you understand, how it connects back to what you're doing. So then I think the second thing to ask yourself is, am I in an echo chamber? So the answer is probably yes, you are in the echo chamber. The image that you're seeing here, if you haven't had a chance to check this out, was a Wall Street Journal article about sort of red feeds, blue feeds, and if you don't, you should. It's interactive, so you can go in. I picked abortion here, and it shows you kind of the conservative and the liberal articles that show up in in our feeds. But if you're in an echo chamber, you are in an echo chamber. So it doesn't make you a bad person. It just really makes it more challenging to create messages that might reach people who have the potential to be your allies. And I think we all have to consider that there might be another side to an issue that you're talking about. And you might not even know that other side exists. And so you actually have to go into somebody's echo chamber and kind of get messy and dirty and figure it out that way. So a couple ways that I did that. So this is, sort of in the wake of the election, I changed the way that I get information. And so a few ways that I did that, right, is I created a bunch of Twitter lists, right? So I think this is getting, yes, Jennifer, we're getting at the how do you access other people's echo chambers. So so Twitter list is one way. Apple News is another electronic way. But so however you get your morning reading or your evening reading, whenever you tend to do your reading, I think if you are if you consider yourself progressive, make sure you're reading the National Review. If you consider yourself conservative, make sure you're reading the Huffington Post. Everybody really could read both of them. Other things that I did is I signed up for, I started following a bunch of evangelical churches on Facebook. Sean made the good one of sign up for the NRA's email list. So, they don't, as he said, they don't care who's on it. And you start to kind of immerse yourself in the way that other people view the world. And so I think this is kind of an important piece of starting to understand that. So, so when it comes to messaging around taboo topics, and I think we'll get into some examples, because I think seeing this play out in examples is actually more helpful than talking about some of the kind of strategic framework. But just to kind of give you a little bit of a sense of it. So so number one is you've got to stand for something, right? And so I think that when you stand in your values and speak to how issues connect to your values, you are much more likely to be fighting for something than fighting against something. So it's like, what is the world that you hope that you are living in? How do you communicate that? And then specifically tie a taboo or uncomfortable topic into that strategy. The second piece is really using data to test your messages. So we talked about using data to understand an issue. Using data to understand your message is, I think is also, important. So so there are things that are out there, right? So the Frameworks Institute, some of the work around American aspirations, which we'll talk a little bit more about, that have done some of this work on behalf of different issues or the field. So you can go and check it out, right? And so I think that's a good place to start. Personally, I like to use my 5-year-old son on issues a lot, because I think that if I can explain an issue to him, I was actually thinking the other day about, how could I explain abortion to my 5-year-old, right? And so, because that's kind of a complicated topic. And so I think I probably would say, and I haven't done this yet, so I'll have to do it, and I will report back to you guys. But it's, I'm helping people talk about who's in charge of making tough decisions, right? So it's like, is the government in charge or are individual people in charge? And so sort of like, who gets to decide how hard decisions are made that impact families? So, so thinking, sort of thinking about that. Knowing the landscape and the language. So I think this is something from my experience working with Be the Change and Opportunity Nation, just really understanding whether or not you're using, words that are favored by Democrats versus favored by Republicans. So for example, that Democrats will use words like equity and poverty, whereas Republicans will use words like economic mobility. There's no real right or wrong. It's just kind of knowing, sort of knowing what you're doing and knowing the words that you mean. So I didn't know that false accusation was going to sort of like set off the, men's rights activist groups. Had I talked more about male survivors, which is something that I also care very much about, that would have been received in a totally different way. So it was just, understand, if you're going to step on a landmine or if you're going to go negative, it's like do it on purpose, don't do it by accident. The building the clear connections, I'm seeing a couple of, examples kind of coming up here is that, you definitely still need to connect back to your issue and back to your mission, right? And so, so I think that, starting with that internal conversation and applying a bunch of these same tactics to your internal conversations, so really understanding the issue, considering it from all angles, kind of unpacking the ways in which it might connect to your mission. We just came out of a Greenlight Fund staff meeting, and we're talking about the ways in which our grantee organizations might be impacted by various outcomes around immigration, right? And so I think by starting that internal conversation first and getting comfortable talking about an issue that, that we haven't talked publicly about before, I think is a really important and really valid place to start. And it also kind of helps you take the temperature of the degree to which this issue is going to be comfortable or uncomfortable for the folks inside of your organization, on your board, in your sort of immediate network, as you're kind of able to do some of that that testing. But I think a couple of ways to think about connecting to your issue. So I was thinking to myself, well, what if I were an animal cruelty organization? Then I probably couldn't talk about the issue of sexual violence. And so then I started thinking about it, and I thought to myself, well, you know what? If I had a large email list, and I knew that there were a lot of people who gave to our organization, but that were likely survivors of sexual violence, how might I think about connecting to that issue? So it wouldn't be changing my mission from being an organization that was protecting animals. It would be doing something like reaching out to a local rape crisis center and offering to show up at their next walk or something with some cute puppies and take some pictures and then write about that in a blog post, because it would be a way for me to sort of show up and stand up for an issue that I know is important and that connects to the values that I have as an organization, right? Which is, but it would still be connected to the work that I actually do. And so I think sometimes it's like the reason that you've got to really think 360 is that it can take some trial and error to come to a way that you connect to an issue, because sometimes it's not appropriate to talk about an issue, and sometimes it's a tough thing to do, and so sort of really thinking about what your options are and being creative about it, I think is important. And then finally, it's this sort of expect the unexpected. So when I posted that graphic on Tumblr, it was just me, and I woke up the next morning, and thankfully I had some friends who were willing to be on my volunteer crisis communications committee. But I think it's one of those things where when you step out on a controversial topic, it can hit really well or it can hit not so well. And so and so so maybe your CEO is going to be on the Today Show tomorrow. Maybe you are going to be putting out a whole bunch of social media fires and figuring out like which trolling behavior is, you should respond to and which you should ignore and which you should report and which you should be scared about. And those, I think those things happen. And so I think it's, especially if you're stepping out on an issue for the first time, having that kind of, best and worst case scenario plan in place is important. But I think oftentimes it ends up the feeling that you feel before you do it, and the anticipation is much worse than what actually happens. And so, so that's kind of, in a nutshell, the why and the how. I'm excited to talk to you more about examples. I've seen some good questions coming in. So Sean, should we pause for a couple of questions that we might not have gotten to?
Yeah, why don't we do that? And in some cases, maybe there's a way for us to find just a slight adjustment on some of the things you talked about, because some of these questions, I think, line up with some of the things you've said. Why don't we start with one from Erica and Norris? I'm going to combine your question, and I'm going to frame it around the idea of the Kanye conundrum, right? Which is, as we all know, Ye likes to talk about almost anything and everything. But I'm going to use Norris's question to get us there, and it's this.
Yep.
How should organizations think about drawing the line between including more issues in their scope of work and avoiding mission creep? Right? And this is the question I think that really is at the heart of why a lot of folks are tuning in today. They are strategic communicators, and oftentimes strategy says we have to say no to lots of things. And you're encouraging us to find ways to say yes. And so I think if we can build out a little bit more, what are the ways that we can find ways that are true to who we are as organizations or our institutions that we serve, but that don't feel like mission creep and that are defensible and in line with advancing our own missions? How do you get there?
Yeah. I mean, so I think it is again starting with your mission first, right? So it's, if your mission is around education, how are these issues impacting education, and to talk about it through that more narrow strategic lens, right? Where I think it ends up being tough is when we are in moments of sort of community or national trauma, in the wake of something really upsetting happening, right? So, if somebody running for president talked about assaulting women, for example. What can we, should every single nonprofit organization and foundation come out and say, like, no, that's ridiculous, that's wrong, no way? Probably not. But I think the internal conversations and having those conversations internally are important. And then I think that oftentimes it's those internal conversations that sort of lead you to a way to connect with a topic that is often just sort of bubbling under the surface, right? And so, so I think sometimes our impression that an issue is not on mission is actually incorrect. And so I think it's that first step. So if you're absolutely sure that you've looked at this issue from all angles and it still doesn't really connect to what you're doing, then go ahead. But I think some of the examples that we're gonna talk about are there ways to be a little bit subversive or creative in the way that you do other kinds of communications, right? And so are there ways to sort of highlight somebody, highlight a recipient of services in your organizations that also has an experience around being, of a different religious background, or, I think we talk a lot about in a diversity and inclusion, perspective around including different kinds of faces and experiences in the way that we communicate about our work. But I think the same goes for things like survivors of sexual violence, or, sort of people with different political beliefs. I think there are ways to sort of highlight those that are not kind of front and center, or changing your grant making strategy, or changing your missions organizations. And I don't think that's what we're saying at all. I think we're saying to be creative.
Gotcha. And let me just add a couple of data points that maybe will help empower people, because I know in many cases what we're dealing with here is some structural challenges within our own organizations, where people are, where some institutions are just disinclined to use their voice. And so let me just share something with you that I think has been making the rounds. Perhaps you've already seen this, but if not, hopefully this is helpful. Independent Sector did a survey a little bit earlier this year prior to the election. It was conducted by both Democratic and Republican pollsters, and they talked to voters across the United States. And what they found was 75% of Americans, so 3 out of 4 folks that you would bump into on the street, had deep respect, trust, and admiration for social sector organizations. So that's foundations and nonprofits. They saw them as problem-solving forces for good in our society. Now, you might think to yourself, well, 75%, that's pretty good. Here's why it's great. Most other institutions in our society right now are lucky if they're pinging in the tens and teens, right? Banks, government, big corporations all have approval ratings or trust ratings below 20%. So the fact that we are working in this very important and unique space and with the level of trust is really extraordinary. The other finding, which I think is even more encouraging, is that 85% of the folks that they surveyed, 85% wanted to hear more from foundations and nonprofits. So it's not just a matter of being creative. There's also a real impetus in the sense that there's an audience out there that's looking for your voice, looking for guidance, wants to know what you think, what you feel, what you believe, and they're looking for you to be moral pillars in our society. So that's a real welcome opportunity. All right, I'm going to get off my soapbox and go to Jennifer's question, which I think is a great one. She's talking about news sources and how do we diversify the places where we go to get information. And her question is, are we looking for folks whose views are at odds with our own personal views, or are we looking from a professional lens? So in other words, do we need to adjust the clips that we're getting in the office the CEO sees, or are we talking about our personal Twitter feeds, or is that both?
I think I think it's both, right? So, and I think it starts with your own, right? And then I think when you start to do that, then you are better able to do to do that part of your job, which is to make sure that the leadership in your organization also is understanding and being educated about a sort of full 360 view of an issue and how your organization's work is affected by it.
Sarah writes in, and forgive me, I'm going to try to condense this. It's kind of a long question, Sarah. I work in health, and we and some of our close partners have come to the realization that we need to talk about racism, as it is a primary driver of health disparities. However, we find the easier issue for people to talk about is poverty because of where it places fault. And we have to accept our own complicity in creating a racist system, but we don't have to accept blame for others' poverty. So when we say racism causes health disparities, the conversation becomes, well, really, it's a poverty issue, which happens to affect people of color at a higher rate, but it's not a race issue. So how do we keep the conversation on track when, in order to make progress, a large portion of our audience has to accept some piece of blame for the current situation?
Yeah. So I think that's a tough one, right? So it's sort of talking about how you're kind of bumping up against kind of a couple of different uncomfortable conversations and folks to sort of to bring along, right? And so so one is that I would encourage you to kind of look out there and see if there are other sort of messages, or data that really kind of support the kinds of conversation that you're having that are perhaps sort of independent of your sort of a personal opinion, right? And so so the Opportunity Agenda, for example, does some great work about kind of how to talk about race and poverty together, both in terms of messaging and data. And so I think it's absolutely like what you're talking about, but it's my question would also be is sort of when you're saying you find it's an easier issue for people to talk about, it's like which people and who are you who are you trying to communicate which messages to, and to sort of be really clear about that, because I think that for some people is will absolutely understand the intersection between those two issues. If they're, my question is like, is that an internal audience? Is that an external audience? Is it a part of your overall audience? Sort of how are you thinking about communicating with them? I think what is true is that, whatever the issue is that there, and whatever organization you're in, is that you do have lots of different audiences that you are communicating with in strategic ways, and thinking about how you position and frame conversations and being okay with the fact that those conversations sort of might be at different moments in time, I think it is a good kind of perspective to keep in mind. And I think there are some organizations that are out there that are talking to people who are, sort of further along in terms of their awareness about racial justice, their awareness about issues related to poverty, the intersectionality of, race, gender, and class. There are other folks who are new to the conversation, and so and there are organizations that are specifically focused on people who are newer to the conversation. So figuring out kind of like who you are and where you fall in that spectrum, I think helps you define and narrow down your communication strategies around it as well.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. Listen, I think in the interest of time, why don't we go ahead and move forward? I know we still have some questions for us. We had hundreds of folks sign up for this webinar. We will try to get to as many as we can over the course of this hour. Sarah has been very generous. She's available through Twitter, but she's also going to be joining us in the members community. So if you're a Communications Network member, you can hop in there if you've already logged in and ask Sarah questions there. We'll continue the conversation there. We'll have a little bit of time at the end for a few more questions. But Sarah, why don't we go ahead and move to the case studies, because I know you've got some really fantastic examples that might help answer some of the questions that we have right now.
Yes, no, and for sure, and I would be so excited. I mean, I could talk all day about how to talk about uncomfortable things, and so, and a lot of it is really specific to your organization's mission, your audiences, and which topic you're trying to talk about, and so we should absolutely take advantage of that member community time as well. So I'm going to go through as many of these examples as we have time for, with some kind of stories about them, starting with this idea of kind of, how to start and end with values. So we kind of had referenced the American aspirations work, which I'm a huge fan of, and kind of really ask some simple questions about kind of what is, it's like, what is it that you want for your country? What kind of country do you want to live in? And really frames those questions up. You should definitely check this work out. And what I think this did, so there was a presentation on this at the end of the ComNet conference in Detroit, and afterwards my colleague and I got into the car with an Uber driver who wanted to talk about the election. And it was one of those things where it was sort of that tense moment where you thought maybe it was going to head into a very polarized conversation. But since I had just walked out of this, I said, hey, well, why don't you let's talk about what is it that you want, like what kind of government do you want to have? What kind of country do you imagine us living in? And it pretty immediately transformed the conversation from one that could have been something that was very contentious and uncomfortable to one where there were clear differences in the way that we were thinking about the issues, but it got to some really, some interesting information, right? And so I think, thinking about how to transition, using your values to transition a polarized conversation into a human one is something that I think is absolutely possible. The other one that I wanted to highlight, and I know there was somebody else who talked about the amazing response they got about doing a communication about inclusivity post-election. I'm sure that there are many organizations in here that did that kind of communication and got a good result. And so just one example is Rip Rapson from the Kresge Foundation, who wrote a great op-ed for the Detroit Free Press in the wake of the election that was really about, we are an organization that stands in our values. And in that conversation, he named a lot of the uncomfortable sort of conversations that had come up in the election, whether it was Islamophobia, whether it was sexual violence, whether it was race and racism, and that was, I think, incredibly important. And so, but it's the combination of talking about your values and then specifically tying them back and naming the issue that you're talking about that I think really kind of starts to do the magic. The other thing I wanted to talk about was messengers, right? So why am I showing you these three guys? So I'm showing you these three guys because these are three examples of kind of unexpected messengers. And so what I want to be clear about is is this idea of how we give up privilege, right? And so there's one conversation that's about diversity and inclusion and how we're making sure that overall we are really working to communicate in a way that reflects the communities that we serve, right? On the other hand, when I started this webinar and I knew that I was going to be sharing with you my personal story of sexual violence, my heart was racing, I felt adrenaline, I felt warm, I felt nervous, I felt scared. And and the things that I thought to myself, well, maybe these people aren't going to take me seriously as a communicator because I'm telling you something traumatic that happened to me. Maybe the next time I'm having a conversation with somebody and I get passionate about something, they're going to think, well, she's just an advocate. And what that is that the willingness to work through that anxiety is that's what it is to give up privilege, right? So that's privilege that I have. That's privilege that I am willing to give up. And so I think when we think in terms of examples of people who can give up their privilege, so and also connect their work and be a messenger on a topic in an interesting way. So Mark Edwards, who I used to work with at Opportunity Nation, he's now leading an organization that's focused on reproductive health. So he's standing up here talking about the importance of IUDs and long-term contraception for women as a way to ensure their economic mobility in America. So I think he's not the person that you would expect to see talking about this particular issue. If any of you saw Chris Evans or Captain America take a stand on the whole rape conversation in The Last Tango in Paris, I think this is another one where that he took it on himself. He had the privilege to give up, and he did it, and he stepped forward. This guy on the right is somebody who's, sort of not a celebrity and not a nonprofit leader, but this is a guy who, in the wake of the election, took a sign that said "You belong" and went and stood in front of a mosque. And this picture actually went viral, and I think part of the reason that it was, that it was so powerful was that it was somebody who was a messenger who was powerful, a messenger who had some privilege to give up. And I think that, this again really applies across the board, right? So it's, as white women, am I, as a white woman myself, am I also talking about race? Am I talking about religious diversity? Are men of color talking about sexual violence and talking about gender oppression? Are immigrants immigrant communities talking about marriage equality? So I think there's lots of different ways. Everybody has a way that they can stand up for those who are, those who shouldn't have to give their voice. And so I think, a lot of times, we hear it shouldn't be on the backs of survivors. It shouldn't be on the backs of people of color to do all of the educating. And so, and I really believe that. And I happen to be a survivor who has some energy to do that. And so, but that's my call and my choice. But it would be nice if I didn't always have to be the one bringing up the issue of sexual violence in the conversations and in the organizations that I'm in. So then a couple of just, kind of creative strategies and examples. So this, I think, kind of gets at, again, sort of how you stay on mission, but still connect to taboo topics. So, a bunch of these are examples of sexual violence just because it's the issue that I know the best, but I think that the strategy can apply in lots of different ways. So the first is the National Mentoring Resource Center is an organization that provides resources to mentoring organizations across the country, right? So they care about mentors. And so when we wake up thinking about an issue that matters to us, we think about that issue in particular. Now, when the National Mentoring Resource Center wakes up, they think about mentors because that is the mission of their organization. And so so if you're talking about mentors, lead with mentoring. And so what happens here is that I was able to help develop a resource with the help of the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center that was about responding to disclosures of sexual violence as a mentor. So if I'm in a mentoring relationship and somebody tells me that they were sexually assaulted or abused, what should I do and say? That's actually, that's an important, valid resource that has value to the audience that this particular organization was trying to serve. Reimagining Service is another one. That was one where we highlighted the ways in which Rape Crisis Center had a really strong volunteer management program. I think we had referenced before, the picture on the right here is from Love Has No Labels, which I think is just a great communications resource to check out if you haven't. But mentioned before is that if you are highlighting a grantee organization or a client that you serve, are you using that as an opportunity to sort of tell the whole story of their life? And in a lot of cases, that might mean connecting to their racial identity, their religious identity, their a history of trauma or sexual abuse or violence. And so, are you creating the space to allow that part of their story to come into a communication that may have another ultimate purpose? So, so telling meaningful stories, I think, is another kind of really important piece. Making or using data, and so I think had mentioned this. This here is the Opportunity Index, which was a tool that helped to shift conversations about poverty to a broader conversation about levers of opportunity in communities. It was the initial funding from the Annie E. Casey Foundation, which also produces Kids Count, which I think plays a similar role in terms of providing a neutral data framework. So thinking about if you're starting from ground zero and you're not really sure where to start with the data. If the data doesn't exist, like go fund it or find it or make it or something. Do a survey. Do a research project. And then just a couple other examples. So, this Samaritans poster is, you might not be able to read it, but it basically just says, helpless, lonely, desperate. You're not alone, reach out, and it has the number for the Samaritans hotline, which is a suicide prevention organization. But this doesn't actually say suicide on it. And this was a partnership with the MBTA here in Boston. And I think just a really creative way of connecting to the issue of suicide prevention, which is also a real issue for the MBTA, because if somebody jumps in front of the train, that becomes a transportation issue. And offering a way for people to connect and be helpful. And then this last one is another one that I love, which is this group called Shattering the Silence. And this is it's a sexual violence prevention organization that is based in a social justice institute connected to a African American church here in Boston. And so this is, from a church perspective, it's, we are a church. Our mission is around religion and religious education. The people who come to our church are African American communities. So therefore, we must be involved in social justice, and therefore we must be involved in the issues that are impacting the people that we serve. And that's how this particular organization really got to and got deep into the issue of sexual violence, and has been a hugely popular program in their church that's now being spread to churches across the country. So those are the examples. I mean, if you have other examples, I would love to hear about them, and please, share them with me. And just in terms of wrapping up and promising to give you that kind of like third part of my story. So I went back and I listened to people, and I got curious about the issue of sexual violence. So recognizing that as a survivor, I kind of did not really understand how to communicate about it. And what I learned is that the messages that we're sending men about sexual violence were not resonating, right? And that they weren't addressing the questions and concerns that men in particular had about sexual violence. So there is a lot of talking to men about how not to rape. There was a lot of talking to men about how to stop their friends from raping. Men were very silent on this issue, and I thought it was because they were defensive or complicit. And what I learned by talking to them and surveying them is that really many men were feeling helpless and sad, and that they were eager for support. And so I interviewed and surveyed hundreds of men over the last year, and summarized what I learned at this TEDx Beacon Street talk just last week or last month, and essentially, it's like what the summary is the mindset that I've adopted for uncomfortable conversations at an individual level. So we talked about communication strategies, but from an individual level, sort of where I am about sort of what I've learned about talking about sexual violence is that you have to tell the truth. You have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, because there is some level of discomfort that's never going to go away. You've got to drop the blame game, because blame makes us focus on the cause of the problem, not our role in the solution. You need to be practical. So I think it's great to have the theoretical conversations about gender violence and masculinity, but a lot of men want to know, if somebody tells you if they were raped, should you hug them? And they deserve an answer. Those questions deserve answers, not judgment. And then finally, we've got to believe in healing, and we've got to believe in the world that we want to live in together. And so that's really sort of where my work on the issue of sexual violence has landed, and why I remain so passionate and committed to helping lots of individuals and organizations figure out their pathway to navigating uncomfortable conversations. So I think we've got about 5 minutes, Sean, for questions, which I would be happy to continue to answer.
Wonderful. Yeah, we do have a few outstanding questions. Let's see if we can try to get through them. Sandra asks, what if you're a corporate foundation and the issues that you may want to talk about could bother the corporate clients out there? So how do you make the space to have these conversations when there are folks out there who might be surprised, concerned, and might have negative consequences on your organization when you step forward?
Yeah. So I mean, I think there's two ways. So one is I would make sure that my belief that the issue would bother the corporate clients was based in fact, and not in my assumption about how they might respond. I think I think that there are ways to sort of, whether it's offering kind of, we're thinking about a number of issues, what's your kind of general take on this? And if you're able to have those kinds of conversations, I think to make sure that you're really sort of, grounding it in fact. And then I think the other thing is to have some of those internal conversations first, and which could give you more information about whether or not it would really kind of bother the clients, or not. Again, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's more of a risk. Sometimes it's worth the risk. So I think you've got, I think you start with the internal conversation and you start with gathering some data about it. I'm not suggesting that you kind of like wake up tomorrow and, like send out a public communication about an issue that you've never talked about before.
Gotcha. Frankie has a question relating back to the example you gave of Captain America. Do messengers necessarily have to be people who are unexpected, or do they have privilege to give up? Is that critical? Is that necessary?
I think it's not an either or. I think it's a both and, right? And so I think that considering your messengers, and for the issue of sexual violence, it shouldn't have to be survivors who are speaking up all the time about sexual violence and what its impact is on people's lives. And frankly, I think if more, husbands, brothers, fathers, sons, not that you need to have a personal relationship with a survivor in order to care about the issue, but I think that there are certainly voices that are not being leveraged, right? And so I think it's really is that if you want to be effective at communicating about an uncomfortable issue, are you leveraging all of the messengers that you have at your at your disposal? And and in some cases it's is that it feels uncomfortable to talk about something that you haven't talked about before, and so we sometimes default to somebody who seems more comfortable about it. But that to really think about that critically and make some choices based on who's going to be the most effective, who are you trying to reach, and have you really asked people to take a stand on something.
I think we're going to have to leave it there in respect for everybody's time. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Before you sign off, a little survey is going to pop up on your screen. Please take it. It's a great way for us to figure out how to make these things better, although I hope you'll agree, I think this was a really wonderful and extraordinary session. I can't begin to express my gratitude to Sarah, both for your bravery and courage and also for the wisdom that you've shared with us. Really do appreciate it. We'll be back, but not before next year, so keep an eye out for our next webinar. In the meantime, please do keep an eye on the next change agent, which should be arriving in your mailbox if you are a network member in just a matter of days, within the next week or so. So thanks, everybody, for joining us. Be well. Happy holidays. Do appreciate you taking the time to be with us today, and we'll see you again very soon. Cheers.
What do you do?